afternoon. Welcome to session 3 of the AI training course. Hopefully those that weren't here last week managed to get to the video and have a look at that. Last week, what we focused on was, if you recall, what I called the inner harness, the agent loop, the tools, the context window, the artifacts, 3 different surfaces for accessing that engine. That agent that we built was a generic agent. It could be anyone's agent. It happened to be running on our persona Alex Okafor and his week of notes, but they were just inputs that we plugged in. The same loop, the same tools, same surfaces that would work for you, for me, or for anyone. But today we're going to change that. Today we're going to make that agent loop yours. The reason that this is a natural next step is because 2 weeks ago, after session 1, you all went away and built that persona file as some homework. And that persona file was really to be used in a chatbot. Give the chatbot enough context about you so that it answers the questions that were tailored to your role, your style, your situation. And as we all know, better context equals better answers. We know that from the earlier sessions. And then last week, we used that same persona file, Alex Okafor's version, to drive an agent loop. The model figured out what was in the directory, read the persona, read the week of noise, and then produced our weekly digest. So today we're going to put those two ideas together. We're going to put the idea of the persona plus the agent loop plus some memory that we're going to talk about. And then once you have a personal agent, the question then shifts from what can this thing do for me to what should we be doing for me on an ongoing basis. So week after week and month after month. So that's kind of the mindset reframe that I want you to get today. So I'm also going to come back to a quote that I made from an earlier session, which was from Daniel Miessler. And I used that last week, I think, which captures that mindset shift from what would I do if I had 1,000 employees at my disposal. And today we're going to be hiring employee number 1 of those 1,000. And we're going to call it your digital chief of staff. And we'll talk about why that is in a moment. What is the purpose of today's session? So as I said, last week, we covered the inner harness, which is really kind of this generic agent loop. And then today we're going to make that agent loop yours. We're going to personalize it. And then we're going to take that persona file that we built and we're going to plug that into an agent loop that we looked at from last week. And then we're going to frame that as your digital chief of staff, so your first AI employee. And the AI industry has kind of converged on a structure for these personalized agents. And you'll recall we called that the agent harness. Some people also call it the agent operating system or agent OS. And there's 7 layers to this. And that's basically what we're going to walk through today. And we're going to go step through each one of those 7 layers. And then by the end of it, you're going to have a single map of where this is all going across the rest of the course. And then we're also going to give you a real downloadable starter project, which we're going to fill in over the course of the week as part of our homework. I'm going to make one more important point before we go on further. Building a personal agent, the one that helps you over weeks and months and years, it needs 2 additional things that the chatbot never needs. The first is this idea of a longer term memory. So a chatbot conversation kind of lives in one context window. We talked about the context window. You ask, it answers, the conversation ends, and that's it. The memory's gone. But your goals don't fit into one session. You're trying to do a project that maybe takes 3 months. You're trying to maybe lose weight over a year. You're trying to get a new job that takes 6 months. So the agent has to remember what it did last week in order to be really useful. And so we're going to change your way of thinking a bit here. And that is this kind of idea of multi-session. So when I work, I don't just have one Claude session open. I often have multiple sessions. Sometimes I can have up to about 10 sessions running at the same time. And they're all got different tasks that my agent is working on. For example, I'll set one goal and then I'll put it in a Claude session and I'll send my agent off to go and work. And then I'll pick up on another one that maybe I set him a goal half an hour ago and is now finished. And so I can then pick up on that and work on the next task. This whole multitasking mindset is quite important to really taking advantage of this new, what I call the 1,000 employee mindset. The second thing that we need to have in this agent that isn't in a chatbot is this idea of the ability to learn and adapt. And this idea of static instructions, that's no longer enough. The agent needs to know what's already happened, notice what it's working on, what's not working, and then start to adjust. Otherwise, you end up rewriting the same instructions again every single time, and the agent never gets any better. So this idea of being able to learn and adapt, and this idea of memory, those are the 2 kind of key requirements, and that we're going to build out into the rest of this course. And that's kind of part of this wider architecture. So the persona work that we did, that was kind of a first step towards that thinking, but we're going to take that a lot further today as part of this whole personalization of our agent. Let me just pull up the wider agenda and what we're going to cover. I'm going to spend just a few minutes on what I've just mentioned about this whole personalization pivot and making the whole agent loop very personal and make that a little bit more explicit. Then I'm going to introduce the idea of the chief of staff concept, and then this thing that I call compounding returns. And that's why your first chief of staff agent is quite difficult. But then when you get to your fifth one, of course, it's a lot easier. I'm going to ground this in a concrete example, my Thames Water story, which I think I might have mentioned to a few of you, and it's in one of my blog posts at kevinslater.com. And then really the meat of the session is going to be these 7 layers. So I'm going to pick up each one in turn and just go through each of these layers with my own kind of commentary on, what each of these layers are and how it works. And then I'm going to pick up on this GitHub repo, basically this, what I call a starter project, which is where we make it tangible and where you're going to be building on it. And that's what you're going to be downloading during the course of this week. And then we'll start working on it next week. Now, I know some of you are probably thinking, I don't know anything about coding. I know, Mandy, you dropped me a message earlier today, and I don't want you to be afraid of the code. I mentioned this in an earlier session. Okay, the idea is if you can speak English, then you can code. Okay, and that's because your agent is going to be doing the coding for you. You don't have to look at a single line of code if you don't want to. If you want to, of course you can, but really you're just going to be evaluating the outcomes, and your agent is going to be doing that work in the background. And then I'm going to close with the homework and what we're going to be picking up for next week. I'm going to come back to this diagram that we had last week, our agent loop diagram. And I'm going to just recap a little bit and kind of talk about this personalization idea. So the persona file that you wrote after session 1, okay, that was, as I say, it was for a chatbot. And the point was that when you ask the chatbot a question, it would have a much richer context about your role, communication style, your priorities, and then the answer comes back, a lot more tailored. Better context is better answers. That's the whole idea. It's like, one question, but a very tailored response to what you get. So we kind of put this persona file into this agent loop, and it was able to kind of generate that weekly digest, iterated through the loop until it decided that goal was achieved. So, and that took about a minute to run. Today, we're kind of going to graft those two things together, and the resulting thing is going to be more of a personalized agent where the goal isn't just a single task. It's going to be kind of this idea of ongoing support for all of your goals over the much longer period of time. And that changes things quite significantly. So the single task, of course, fits into a single session, generate this week's weekly digest, done in a minute, loop closes, that's it, we're done. But ongoing support, as I mentioned, doesn't fit in a single session. It goes over days, weeks, months, and years, and the loop, therefore, has to be different. It has to be kind of bigger with this idea of memory between the sessions and the ability to look back at what happened, learn from it, and adjust. And so that's what today is all about. So why am I calling this a chief of staff? And I'm going to come back to the Daniel Miessler quote again. What would you do if you had 1,000 employees at my disposal? And then most of us kind of get stuck on this idea of like, well, I don't even need 10 people. What would I do with 1,000? Okay, and the way is not to think about the fact that there's 1,000 employees. Think about what role would you hire first? Okay, not the 1,000th employee, but the first. And the first hire, I think, is quite foundational. It's quite a foundational one because that's what kind of the rest are all going to be built on. And imagine that you've got plenty of money, you've got millions in the bank, money's no object. So then who is the first hire? Well, typically you would hire a chief of staff. And why a chief of staff? Because if you're super rich, that's kind of the person that you hire that knows your goals, they know your long-term aspirations, they know your short-term priorities. They help you with your mundane stuff, okay? The boring tasks that kind of fill up your week actually don't necessarily move you forward on their own. It's the type of person that keeps you focused at those things that really matter, not the things that are just shouting loudest at any one point in time. And they literally runs in loops, nudges forwards all the things that are your small tasks that really need to be moved forward without you really having to ask. That's why this idea is a chief of staff. In the fullness of time, this chief of staff then becomes the agent that manages your other agents, your next employees, employees, the rest of the 1,000. So when eventually you hire a research agent, a content agent, your accounting agent, your travel planning agent, your chief of staff is the person who kind of coordinates between all those other agents. Okay, but that's later. So today we're just going to focus on the first one, your number one agent, because we need to kind of get this foundation right. So that's why chief of staff is really your first employee. I'm going to pick up on something I mentioned a little bit earlier, and this is the idea of compounding returns. There's a reason why this first agent is the one that really matters a lot. Okay? And that's because your first agent is hard to build. You're not just building your first agent, you're actually building the foundation of a system. Okay? As at the same time as you're trying to build out your first agent, trying to get the structure right. It's probably going to take weeks to get right. You need to build the foundation and then also make sure that that whole foundation can settle. And it's not that the code itself is hard. I mean, it's really just a bunch of markdown files that are going to be stored somewhere on your computer. But it's getting the structure right. What are the files that I need? What does the persona look like? Where do I store the memory? What skills do I want? And it's that structure that takes a little bit of time, and really you need to work with it and get it to settle first before you start building the others. And then your second agent, okay, that might take a few days. Okay, maybe your research agent, as I said, or your content agent, or if you're coding, a technical building agent. But the thing is, it then starts inheriting all the other things that we built with our first. Okay, it knows your context, it knows your voice. You don't have to set up that structure again. Okay, you're going to reuse it. And all you're going to be doing is, for this agent, you're going to be adding a job description, you're going to be giving it some skills, and that's a lot easier. And then, of course, by your 5th or your 10th agent, it's going to be a lot easier. And then eventually you're going to wonder, how did I live without this system? And that's the idea of these compounding returns. Build the first one once, build it right, and then every future agent inherits that. And this idea of compounding returns means that you get much more value out of the later ones that you build. The next thing I want to pick up on is something called atomic habits. I don't know, has anybody read the book Atomic Habits by James Clear? If you haven't, I highly recommend it. Fantastic book, really easy read, but fantastic. And the core thesis is that these very small habits compound. You're kind of making these 1% improvements every single day, but they're very, very small. And then each day, as you start adding more and more of these very small habits, and you start repeating them, those habits start compounding over time. And 1% better on a new habit and something which starts compounding, those compounding returns, as you know, with interest, 1% every single day adds up to a lot over a year, and really adds up to a lot over 5 years or 10 years. And the connection here to agents, of course, is very relevant. We need our chief of staff to know our long-term goals. So what are these big things that we're trying to get to over maybe 5 or 10 years? And then we want to kind of break that down into these very small, mundane tasks. And each of these things are the ones that move our actions forward every single day. And those small tasks, those are the ones that are really contributing towards these longer-term goals. And each one is kind of a 1% improvement, and that gets repeated and gets compounded. And eventually, these small things are actually moving you towards that longer term goal. And the great thing is, these agents, they thrive on the mundane and the boring. They don't get bored like you and I. They don't procrastinate. They don't get distracted. And they can do those small tasks much quicker than we can manually. So our chief of staff really is the person who handles the tedious stuff. And we can kind of focus then on the bigger picture, guiding the strategy, making the calls, the human-only things. This is the most underappreciated aspect of having an AI agent. Most people think about it having this one-off task tool, like this big thing, can AI help with it? But actually the real leverage, the real advantage is in doing those smaller things consistently and every single day. And then that compounding effect becomes actually quite large. I want to try and ground this in something a little bit more concrete. And so I thought I would relate a story, which I think I might have mentioned to a couple of you, because it's kind of where I really used my AI agent or chief of staff. And I wanted to ground it in something very, very practical. Yeah, when was it? I guess November last year. I got a letter from Thames Water. I'm going to bring up that letter right now. Here is my Thames Water bill with the with the very choice comments that Raquel had left for me to follow up with Thames Water about this bill. In the past, this bill would have joined what I call the pile, my in tray. Maybe I'd have worried about it occasionally. Maybe I'd try to get hold of Thames Water to complain. Probably got frustrated knowing how difficult it is to get hold of Thames Water. And then eventually I probably would have just paid it. Okay, but this time I had my chief of staff. I could have just said, help me investigate this water bill, pull the water data from Thames Water. But what I did was I said, first of all, I want you to go and investigate. And so what it did was it looked at the bill because it could read this and it said, you are aware that you have a water meter. And I was like, no, I wasn't aware of that. It had gone through and established that I had a water meter. And so then it's like, okay, that's interesting. What we need to do is we need to figure out, is this real or not? It said, yes, because you've got a water meter, you can go and pull that data and see if it's real. So it's like, okay, I could, but no, why didn't you do it? My AI agent went off and said, you can go onto the Thames Water website. I gave him the login details and he went in and pulled the data. And he said, I've got the data. Now you can go and analyze that. I said, no, I want you to go and analyze it. My agent went off and analyzed the data and came back and said, it's real. Unfortunately, that is the case. Okay, but there'll be some sort of pattern. So it's like, yes, in fact, there is a pattern. Every second Thursday, your water spikes enormously. It's like, I think I know what's happened. Our gardener comes every second Thursday and waters the garden and leaves the hose pipe running literally the entire day. It was real. My AI agent had figured out what to do, but I wasn't going to leave it at that. I was thinking a little bit bigger. What can you do? The AI agent went away and said, well, having a look at Thames Water, if there was a leak, you could claim for a leak allowance. My gardener must have exposed a leak in my hose pipe. So I got my AI agent to write an email to Thames Water explaining about the leak in my hose pipe and claim a leak allowance on my behalf. 2 weeks later, I get a letter back from Thames Water. We're giving you back the money all of the time that you had this leak and refunded me that money. And then adjusted my go forward direct debit so that basically I wasn't paying this amount. One of the interesting aspects, because this is an AI agent and they can go and do these mundane things, it went away and it investigated a little bit more about exactly how my payments work. And it figured out what I'm paying for is not just for water. I'm actually paying for drainage as well. But in this particular case, my agent came back to me and said, because this water went into your garden, it didn't use the drainage system. So you can actually claim back the portion related to drainage. So I included that in my email and I got the money back for the drainage. This is just a very practical example of how something which typically I would never have done anything about this. And then the good thing is I kind of use this also as a learning experience. One of the other things, the guy that I mentioned about the employees, Daniel Miessler, he's got this other concept which he talks about, which is don't bring your agents into the gym. And what he means by this is if you're going to go to the gym, the whole idea about going to the gym is you want to kind of work your own muscles. If you're going to go to the gym, of course, you don't bring your agent into the gym to lift the weights for you, because the whole idea is that you need to be exercising your own muscles. I took this to heart. I want to learn how to do this myself. So my agent, of course, did all the heavy lifting, going and pulling the water usage, doing the analysis. I wanted to learn from this myself. I used my agent to build a website to monitor this going forward. I can bring up this website because it's on water.gavinslater.co.uk. Every single day, I can see my water usage. My gardener is still watering on the 30th of April. That was a Thursday. He was still watering on that day, but you can kind of see how that changes on those particular days versus my regular consumption. In fact, my agent will alert me when my usage goes over 800 liters a day. And of course, I can just come onto this website at any point in time and see my usage. If I go back a year, these red spikes, these are the ones I was talking about. My agent analyzed for me, and those are the ones that I reclaimed my leak allowance for. Coming back to this idea of don't let your agents into the gym. After I got my agent to help me build this website, I also got it to write a tutorial, which taught me exactly how it went about building that website. I basically said, you've written this website. I want you to teach me how you built it. And it went through step by step and it taught me all of the steps. I learned some of this coding because I wanted to learn about the coding in this particular case, even though my AI agent had done all the original coding itself. So that's this idea of don't bring agents into the gym and how I use that to kind of do some of my own learning as we went along the process. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to move to the full agent harness stack. There's 7 7 layers to the stack. These are all the different components. Each of these layers is now what we're going to go through. We're going to kind of build that as part of what we do. So we've already touched on a few of these layers already. So you'll kind of recognize the identity, talked a little bit about memory and verification and learning, but we're now going to get through these layers one by one. If I come to layer 1, which is our identity. So what is this layer? This is kind of who the agent is. What are the rules it enforces? How is it meant to act every single time you talk to it? We've already covered a little bit about identity when we created our persona file, but now we have an agent. And agents themselves need their own identity. And that identity is going to be supported by a specific file. You'll see we're going to work on breaking up our files into these different components. So first of all, you've got the user MD. Remember, m.md is for markdown, basically text files. And the user MD is who you are, your name, your role, your current focus, your family, the things that anchor every single one of the responses to you. This is basically your persona file, but evolved. Same idea, just kind of adapted really now for ongoing work rather than just these idea of one-off chats. Our next file is soul.md. This is who the agent is. It's personality, hence the word soul. This is the soul of your agent. It's the hard rules. For example, never use the word delve, or never recommend using Notion because I use Obsidian. Be direct, don't use fillers, no preamble. So your agent's identity, if you will. And this is the file that makes Claude or your agent sound like your assistant, not some generic assistant. That's why the word soul is used, because you want to give your agent real personality. So then you've got your Claude.md or your agents.md. You'll remember that from last week because this is the file that gets loaded every single time into context. And think of this as being really the operating rules for whichever tool you're using. Use this folder, not that folder. Read the identity files first. Save any outputs to this directory. Okay, so this is kind of the operating instructions, whereas your soul is the agent's personality. The persona work that you did for session 1, that's, of course, it's not throwaway work because it's really the seed to your kind of user MD, and we're going to spit out some of the agent's personality, the voice, the communication style, the hard rules, and that's going to be moved into your soul. And then there's Claude.md file, which is your operating instructions, or your agents file, depending on if you're not using Claude, but you're using ChatGPT, then it'll be agents.md. So really today's homework is going to be to make that split and start creating some of these additional files to create your identity. That's layer 1. Layer 2 is context. So we've already spoken about this a little bit, about context, so you kind of know what it is. It's what you know. Situation, your roadmap, your projects, your customers, your priorities, the things that a public AI can't get from its training data, okay, because it's very, very specific to you, or it's specific to your company that you work for. And of course, we covered a lot of that in the agent loop from last week. It's kind of what's in your context window. And today we kind of go beyond that. We're going to go into kind of a much bigger picture with project files, client data, lots of additional context things which you really want your longer term chief of staff to have access to. The big question is, doesn't all fit into your context window? You only need to load context into your context window when you need to answer a specific question about maybe a specific client or a specific topic. A lot of this is really just a set of text files or markdown files, which is sitting somewhere on your computer, which has got this context there. So the question is, how do you organize all of this information? If you don't have some sort of system of organization, then it just ends up being maybe one huge document that goes stale eventually. We don't want that. Really, this idea of context curation is quite important. Not just the context that goes in the context window, it's the context that is sitting on those files on your computer that's got all that information about you. And that context curation, this is a practice. It's not a project. And there's quite a few different methodologies that you can follow for organizing that context. To be honest, any of them are going to work. It's not a matter of which one. Okay, it's a matter of committing to one and making sure that you're consistent about that practice of keeping it up to date. I personally use a system called Para. I'm not sure if anybody has heard of the Para system. A guy called Tiago Forte, and he's written a book called Building a Second Brain. And I love his work. It's fantastic. His Para system is about these 4 areas. So the P stands for projects, and that's basically a series of tasks where you've got some sort of specific deadline, you've got an outcome that you need to be met, and that's projects. And then you've got areas. That's the A. And these are ongoing areas of responsibility. There's certain standards that need to be maintained. but there's no end date. There's no specific outcome, but it's an area of responsibility that you have. It might be career, it might be home, those type of things. You have the R, which is resources. These are basically reference files that you're going to come back to. Probably going to be supporting projects, they're going to be supporting areas, kind of resource files that come back to and have a lot of really good information supporting those areas and projects. And then you have the second A, which is archive. And that's basically, I said, you've got to keep this clean. When a project is finished, you archive it. You don't throw it away because you might want to come back to it at some point in time. But it's important to kind of archive it and say that project is now complete. The second one that I use is something called GTD, or Getting Things Done, by a guy called David Allen. His concept is this idea of actions and these small actions. I talked about the compounding returns earlier. You have these very small actions. Each of these small actions are then attached to projects. It's about just moving forward these very, very small actions. And if you want to get a project done, it's not about thinking about the whole project. It's about taking that project and breaking that project down into just the very next thing that can be done to move that project forward, just even 1 inch. You get those actions and you move those actions forward. And if those smaller actions are moving forward, then your project is moving forward. And I kind of use this combination of para and GTD as a way of organizing my context. And my agent also knows that that's how I work. And my agent supports me in those goals, those big high-level goals, and how those high-level goals are broken down into areas of focus and down into projects and all the way down to what I call the runway level, which has got like today's actions. And so that's just how I organize my system. Whatever system you want, you should use that to organize your context. But I would suggest make sure that you stick to it.
Gavin, I use the para system. I read that book, and I can highly recommend it. It's absolutely amazing. And it's really, really simple. Because some of these things, I've read these books and they've melted my head. But the Second Brain book, it's just so clever and so easy to use. And I find it a brilliant way of organizing everything.
Exactly. I love watching his YouTube channel as well. He's done a lot of stuff on AI, and I also highly recommend his AI videos. So that's a bit about context. The next layer is tools and connectors. We've spoken about this when we talked about the agent loop. So I think you kind of know what this is. This is connections that you've got to real systems. That be your email, calendar. If you use some sort of chat system like Slack or Teams or any databases, it's these connectors to those different channels. And then you saw last week how I used the calendar connector to pull that week of noise from my real diary entry. So that's kind of this layer really in action. You've got all these connectors. So you also should have a file called tools.md. This is a file that tells my agent, these are the different connectors that you have access to. And so my agent knows what those tools are, how to use them. So when I ask a question, it knows what tool might be helpful to answer that question, and it can go and find more information about that tool, and then it can load that tool and start using that tool. Of course, having access to those tools, you do need to be a little bit conscious about kind of safety, because if it's got access to those, if it's got access to your email, is it going to go off and start writing emails that I don't want it to? Of course, you need to give it some instructions about, my agent always knows, write it in drafts, and then I'm the one that actually presses the send button. You can kind of build some of these safety things into the system as well. The next one I want to talk about is skills. We briefly mentioned this last year, but we didn't go through it in any detail. So this week I want to pick up in a little bit more detail. So what is this? Skills are really what I would call repeatable workflows, where the agent can fire them automatically. And they just basically processes, procedures, and routines that you do over and over again. And you can turn that into something that the agent can execute without you having to spell out the steps every time. It knows the formula. It knows the procedures. These are the ones that the agent can load, and they can be business ones. They can be personal ones. And the personal ones, actually, I think are quite interesting because they're often invisible to us. If you've got processes at work, you probably have tried to even document them, so you kind of know those work processes, but the personal ones, they're probably so ingrained into our daily lives that we don't actually think of them as being processes. We just do them by way of habit. Okay, your morning routine, your weekly review, the follow-up email after a meeting. Those are the type of things that you really need to think about and say, these are the things I do all the time. Can I create a skill and actually outline for my agent what are the steps that I would typically follow when I do this? And then my agent knows that and can execute that on my behalf. These are really so foundational. I mean, the skills is probably, I think, one of the most important things that you can actually give to your agent. And that's why in the homework later, you'll see I've asked you to start thinking about what some of these things might be. A lot of us are going to start accumulating a lot of these skills over time. And your agent might have maybe 20 or 30 of them. And then what happens is your agent can execute those. And the skill also knows what context needs to be loaded in order to execute that skill. The great thing is this is a concept I mentioned in one of the earlier sessions of progressive disclosure. A skill file has this idea of this front matter, basically just the section, if you look at this example here of a weekly digest, literally just this front matter. And what happens is in the context window, only that front matter gets loaded into the context window. I just need to mention to my agent, can you do my weekly digest? The moment it hears that a skill gets invoked, and this whole weekly digest skill then gets loaded into the context window. And then this whole process actually gets executed. And so it's only at the time of executing it that it needs to load all of the detail. But at the time when you just, haven't executed that skill, literally only this front matter part is the part that's taking up context window. And we talked in the earlier sessions about the importance of keeping your context window very clean. This is exactly what we're trying to do with this progressive disclosure. So I think the skills one, I think, is really, really important. And I want you all to start thinking about what are some of those things, those daily processes that you could start transforming into skills. Automations, so layer 5. So what is this layer? So this is really about agents running when you're not watching. Daily summaries that just arrive in your inbox at 7 o'clock in the morning. Monitoring tasks that ping you when something changes. Scheduled jobs that are just running in the background. So you're not having to tell your agent to do it. Your agent is actually just doing it on your behalf. We touched on this last week when we showed Claude Cowork, and I scheduled a task where I said, okay, run this at 7 o'clock each Monday morning, collect my calendar entries, and then it basically filled up that week of noise, and that could be done every single week. So that's an example of that. In Claude Code, you've got the equivalent, and it's called a cron job, but it's really just a scheduled task. So I've actually got my own scheduler service, which I built for myself. Andy, you've got a question?
So what does cron stand for?
Very good question. I don't know.
No, because I keep seeing it while I'm coding. I'm creating a cron job, and I don't know what it is.
It's just a scheduler, basically. In this particular case, what I've got is I've built my own entire scheduler website. This is where I can come on and actually see all of my scheduled jobs. And I've got a few examples here. So I've got, for example, my daily note generate. What that does is every day that goes at 8:30 in the morning, and it generates a note in my Obsidian file that's basically got information on what is today's weather, what's in your calendar, what important emails have just come in. It's got key stats about my health. How many steps did you do yesterday? What was your heart rate? All of my important health statistics. So information about location, where was I yesterday during the day? And then a little bit about what should you be working on today? So that's kind of my daily note that gets generated. I also have a daily brief that gets generated at 7 o'clock each morning. That does is it looks at my user.md file. It knows what are my interests. It takes all of my interests. It goes and searches the web and picks up relevant stories that are aligned to my area of interest. And it generates a note, basically a summary of news stories relevant to my areas of interest. So that way I don't need to go and search the web. It's gone off and searched the web for me and generated a nice briefing that I can look at, very tailored and personal just to my interests. So those are some of the examples of cron jobs that can be used and how your agent can then be very much personalized to you. The eventual destination of this idea of automations is that your agent then becomes proactive. It reads information on a schedule, and then it starts reaching out to you when something happens that's relevant, and then you don't have to tell the agent every single time. It's monitoring things on your behalf in the background. I mentioned about my water. My agent monitors when the water usage triggers a certain level. It then comes back to me and tells me you've gone over 800 liters for the day. You should be aware of that. I've got another cron job which monitors the temperature in our house in Minnesota. Obviously, we're not there, and especially during the winter time, when it gets down to minus 40 degrees Celsius, that's pretty chilly. We need to make sure that the house is heated to at least 50 degrees Fahrenheit, and if it goes below 45 or above 55, my agent sends me a message on Telegram and tells me that, because if that temperature gets too low, it could freeze the foundations, and that would then destroy the house. So that's kind of quite an important monitoring and very proactive thing that my agent needs to be doing on my behalf. One of the things that I think might resonate with you, I'm hoping that's going to inspire you to try out, is I don't know if any of you have been to one of these start of year strategy or planning sessions for work. Great excitement coming out, but then afterwards you go back to your day job and you kind of forget that it's even happened. But now you've got a chief of staff. What you do is you get out of it. First thing is make sure that you have recorded that session. We talked at the beginning, I use Granola. Doesn't matter whether it's a client meeting or whether it's an internal meeting or a strategy session, record it. Make sure you have that information. As soon as you get back, you give that to your agent. And the first thing is write up the notes. I mean, who wants to write up the notes of a strategy session? It's dull. It's boring. You don't want to do it. Your agent is going to do a much better job of writing up those notes than you. The next thing is you probably came up with a whole bunch of new goals and objectives. Give those to your agent. Okay? Make sure that those are included in your new goals and objectives. And then the good thing is tell your agent, we need to follow up on this. I want you to start looking at all the stuff that we're doing, go through all the meetings that we're doing, and are we actually starting to work towards these new goals and objectives that we just set in our strategy meeting? That way, we don't just forget about it after the meeting. We've got our agent to start being proactive and making sure that we're actually starting to follow up on some of those things that we spoke about, and we don't just forget about it. I'm going to give you another personal example. Two of my challenges that I've given my agent is not just kind of my goals and objectives and what I'm trying to achieve. I've also told it about some of my weaknesses or challenges, as I call it. I have two particular challenges. Number C6, enjoyment of the meta is one of my challenges, which means I like to build the systems rather than producing the output. I have another one, which is procrastination, C1, planning rather than executing. Spend too much time planning and not enough time executing, and I tend to procrastinate and leave these tasks too long. So I have a regular cron job that runs 3 times a day and sends me a message on Telegram to check that I'm focused on my actual to-do list rather than procrastinating or tweaking my system or doing something that I shouldn't. And of course, it knows my actual to-do list, so it knows exactly what I should be working on. And it says the following things you said you wanted to go and work on today. Are you working on those? And so it follows up on those items. Richard, you've got a question.
When you mentioned that it sends you a telegram, by what method do you receive that? What does that mean?
It's an app called Telegram, which is basically the equivalent of a WhatsApp.
Ah, okay, right.
Yeah, I have my agent has its own WhatsApp channel.
Yeah.
And so he pings me on WhatsApp and basically reminds me of the things that I should be working on. So I could use WhatsApp, but WhatsApp is owned by Meta and they just make it a lot more difficult to set up.
Yeah.
So I find it easier just to use Telegram, which is really, really easy to set up. We can do that in a later session. You can all have your own Telegram agent. You can set up WhatsApp if you want. I just find Telegram a lot easier to work with. Next layer is memory. Okay, so what is this? This is the stuff that gets remembered between sessions and deliberately, not just by accident. It kind of solves the longer term memory requirement that we spoke about earlier today. And it's the layer that lets our agent remember what happened last week, not just what's happened in this particular session. And there's 2 parts to this, a file which I have called memory.md. And this is basically long-term curated items that need to be remembered. Okay, so it's kind of the 5% of stuff that's really worth rereading every single session. Key decisions that I've made, important preferences that I've expressed, lessons that I've learned, certain architectural choices about my work. Those really important things that I want my agent to remember long term because they're really important things. The second one is daily memory. And these are basically summaries of what's happened in each of my Claude Code sessions. And because I'm working with my agent all the time, and I mentioned to you, I don't just have one session happening. I can have up to 10 sessions running at any one point in time. And every single one of those Claude sessions, we're kind of working on stuff. And that's important stuff that I want to have stored. And so every session leaves a trace in this daily log. And over time, these kind of accumulate into kind of a treasure trove of memories that allow me to kind of revert back on things that I might have worked on 2 months ago. But then my agent is able to very quickly recall that and where I got to, so that when I go back to a project that I haven't worked on for a couple of months, my agent is immediately productive. He can go back, look at what we covered in that session, get up to speed, and bang, we're already right up to speed and we can be productive. Layer 7, our last one, verification and learning. So what is this? This is really the layer where you check the output before completing a task, and also how the system improves itself over time. Okay, this is the loop that keeps everything really, really sharp. And so the verification part, every agent task needs 3 to 5 quick checks before you trust the outputs. Remember, we had some of those checks that we built into our steps on the weekly digest agent. You can build some of those steps into what you tell your agent to do. Go and verify. But of course, it's always important to have the human in the loop as well, where you're actually checking some of the things yourself. Did it match the tone of my voice? Did it do exactly what I asked it to? I mentioned that I make sure I press the send button on all the emails that get drafted, doing the things in accordance with what I think it should be doing. The complementary part to that, of course, is the learning. And this is basically a regular process. When you do find out that your agent is not doing things in accordance with what you said, making sure that your agent learns from that and updates itself. It's a regular process to kind of update all these markdown files. If it's not doing things in accordance with what I told it, doesn't need to go back and change my identity file. Do I need to add something to my memory.md file? Do I need to go and change the process in my skills file? That whole idea of learning from your mistakes is a really important part of what makes this agent really, really powerful, and making sure that it keeps sharp and keeps on point with how you want it to work on your behalf. I have a skill which I've built for my own agent, and that's a retrospective skill. Have you worked in project management? The whole idea of a retrospective is that after you've done something, you do a retrospective and you go back and evaluate how you did. I have a retrospective skill that I run actually after these training sessions. Okay, so I give it the transcript, ask it to evaluate how I did versus plan. Did I run long? What questions came up that I hadn't anticipated? What landed well? What didn't? And then that helps me update the next sessions. I'm going to come back to something which most of you have probably gone through, an HR performance evaluation process. This is in a way kind of similar to that. Personal opinion is that in these large organizations, these performance evaluation processes are the single worst process that actually exists in any organization. It's really just a tick box exercise. There's no meaningful value in it whatsoever, because it ends up being a game of targeting. The firm comes up with some curve that you need to meet. The right number of people need to be in the right category of meets expectations versus doesn't meet expectations. They're completely arbitrary processes, and they're not based on actual real performance. It really becomes, is my boss able to pitch me well in front of his colleagues or the management team? And then you get these stories like, oh, I shared a taxi with him once and I wasn't really impressed with him at all. I'm serious. That's a real story. If you really want genuine performance of it, you need continuous evaluation of real tasks. And that's difficult. It's boring. It's mundane. It's perfect for AI. But you need to specify in advance what is a task that you actually need done. What does success look like? Again, something that AI can help you with and do very, very well. And then you need this idea of going to evaluate against what should have happened. Okay, so let's take my specific example. So each of the sessions, I have the session outline. I've also got a session script. And so I've got kind of a very detailed, what should I have covered? And then what I do is I give that transcript, and my AI, of course, has got the outline. And then if I've got a recording, if I remember to hit the record button, and then my AI agent could go and look at that and evaluate how I've done. Now, in some respects, AI agents can be a little bit sycophantic. Of course, you do need to tell it, don't be like that. Be honest, be brutal. If you tell it to do that, it'll do that. Of course, my agent now is, of course, going to be listening to this transcript, so hopefully it is going to be brutal when it evaluates the session. And then it comes back and does a real evaluation on that session. Now, that's what real performance evaluation should look like. Now, if you've got lots of these tasks happening, okay, you should be doing your own performance evaluation on exactly those type of tasks. So that's the type of thing I think is a real game changer in terms of real performance evaluation. There's a couple of things that I just want you to remember about this. This is really important, but you've got all these markdown files. So this is your system. If you don't update them, it goes stale. So that's why it's important to have this learning loop and make sure that your files are continuously being updated. As you find your agent is making mistakes, make sure you have this retrospective process and ensure that it comes back and updates itself and keeps all of these files really up to date and well curated. You'll see in our starter kit, I have exactly this retrospective skill in the starter kit. That's all of the 7 layers. So now I want to show you what this actually looks like for real. I am going to open my terminal. Please don't be afraid of the terminal. It's like opening File Explorer. I'm going to go into a particular directory. I'm using the cd command, cd volumes, doc SSD, projects, AI training starter. So it's just a folder on my computer. I'm going to show you on here, AI training starter. I'm in this folder right here on my computer. It's nothing more than that. I'm going to use our ls command, and there's a whole bunch of files and directories on this computer. I'm going to bring it up in here. So hopefully you can kind of see this tree structure here. I'm in the AI training starter. There's a README file, and that's basically just giving an overview, some setup instructions. And when you start building these things, it's always good to have a README file. A README file is just for anyone who comes into this directory. The first thing I want to look at is a README file, which says, what am I looking at? And that's what a README file is. We've got our claw.md, and this is the file that tells our agent what's in this directory and what's this directory all about. And you'll remember that from last week. We then have a memory.md file, and this memory.md file is our curated long-term memory. 5% of things that you really want your AI to remember every single time. I've got a directory called identity. Inside that directory, I've got 3 files: user.md, soul.md, and goals.md. I'm going to go through each of these in a moment. I've got in here homework prompts.md, and in the homework later on, I've got some prompts that are going to help you to start tailoring these files for you specifically. This version over here is just a template, but you're going to use some of those prompts to start filling out some of those files yourself. There's a directory called .claude. The dot in front of it means it's hidden. If you look at the file just in your terminal, it won't be visible to you immediately, but it's a hidden file, and Claude knows this file directory is there, and Claude uses this to keep all of its settings, and it's got various important things in there. One of them is hooks, and what a hook is, for each step in the agent loop, you can run a hook, and there's a hook in here called load master prompt, and what that does is it ensures that every time you start a Claude session, it loads everything in the identity folder. And so what it does is it makes sure that every time you start a Claude session, it's loading user.md, soul.md, and goals.md. And that makes sure that your agent knows who you are, it knows who it is, and it knows the goals that you're working towards. There's also a pre-compact flush hook, and what that does is when you've got a session running, it might run for a few days, and eventually I'll run out of space in the context window. When it gets full, it then compacts. And so what this hook does is, before the compaction happens, it takes everything that we've been working on and it writes it all to my daily memory file to make sure I keep all the rich history about what we've actually been working on. Before I end the session, it then takes everything we've been working on and it creates a really nice summary of that session. So that in 2 months' time, if I want to know, that project we were working on 2 months ago, it's got it in its memory. It can go back and it can pick up both the summary version, if it just wants to get a summary, but also all the detail which has been written in these pre-compact flush is there as well. So I've got all of that in markdown files. And then there's a skills directory. There's a subdirectory called weekly digest, and there's a skill.md file which contains a skill for our weekly digest. All I've done is I've taken those steps which we went through manually and I've turned that into a skill. And then there's a command, and a command is just something which, if I want to run a set of steps on Claude, I can run it at any point in time using it's called a custom command. And in this case, I've got a custom command called master prompt. And what that does is, if we want to learn from our session, I run this master prompt custom command, and then it goes through the whole session and it figures out, did we learn anything from this session? That is going to force me to come back and update user.md, soul.md, goals.md. And so this is the self-learning loop that I talk about. Okay, and so basically this is a special command that looks at the session, learns from the session, and updates our markdown files based on those learnings. And then there's an example week, which of course is just a shape of an example week, which if you want to use that in your example week. And then there's a daily folder. And that daily folder is where all of these sessions are going to be stored so that you've got start accumulating a history of all the stuff that we've been working on. So that basically, that's the starter kit. Hopefully you kind of got a good idea of the actual different files that exist and how it looks for real in a real example agent setup. You saw there's not many files there, but even just with that very, very small example, that's a real agent with some real capabilities, which I think could get started on. I'm actually going to show you a real example. This is my Obsidian folder. What we have is a folder called identity. In this folder, I have my user.md, so it knows all about me. My agent has a soul. I'm Gavin's personal agent. Second brain that remembers the cross sessions, connect to these platforms, proactively surfaces what matters, operate through Claude Code locally and via the unified gateway remotely. Personality and tone, core principles. When drafting emails, how should you operate? What are the boundaries and goals? I mentioned some of my things that I give it about what's important to me. My core purpose. I want to make a meaningful difference through continuous learning and helping others grow. Part of doing this AI training course is me helping meet my core purpose. This is how my agent is helping me fulfill my purpose and principles, 40,000 feet, the vision, the individual goals, my life goals, and my areas of focus. This is a real example of the things that my agent is helping me to try and achieve. I mentioned some of the daily briefs from this morning. So these are some of the stories that got surfaced for me. Five Eyes Cyber Agencies issued joint guidance on agentic AI security. Tells me some sort of action I might want to take. Gives me the source. This was a very interesting one. Anthropic doubles Claude Code rate limits. I always use too many tokens, but now our rate limits have been increased. That is important to me. So this is basically just a bunch of stories which are relevant to me that my agent went and sourced from the web because it knows about me, it knows what I'm interested in. This is my way of getting up to speed each day on the things that are useful to me. That is just my system, which is a real system in action. It's fundamentally no different from the one that you're going to be building. The last thing that we need to cover today is the homework. The homework is to start building the system because next week we're going to be doing it for real. I'm going to give you some instructions. I want you to start building your identity files, your user.md, your soul.md. Of course, if you did the persona homework, this is going to be easy because really it's just adapting what you've already done before. I then want you to start working on your goals file. What is my purpose, vision, goals, areas of focus, projects? What are those things that I want to be working on? Your agent needs to know this because it's going to help you work on these things. The third thing is some skill ideas. I don't want you to write skill files. We'll do that in a session. But I want you to think about what are the things I do every week? What are the things that are tedious that I can outsource to my agent? So just think of some of those things that you want to start automating and putting into skills, and then we'll start building those skill files. In fact, our agent will build the skills for us. I know that's a very meta concept. A skill, it's got its own skill to build skills. Our agent will build those skills for us as long as we just tell it what to do. That's all I wanted to cover from this session. Andy, you had a question?
So I'm sitting in Claude and I want to create a skill. Do I just tell Claude to save that as a skills file?
Yes, you can. You can tell Claude you have access to all of the Anthropic documentation. Go into that documentation and make sure that you familiarize yourself with how a skill file is written. Then write me a skill on the following thing. Okay. And it will then follow the documentation. There is also an inbuilt skill, which via a plugin, which knows how skills should be written, and that skill itself knows how skills should be written. And that's the one we will use. We will use that built-in skill to write other skills.
Bye.
Thank you very much, everybody.